When people think of Mentor, they naturally think of business. After all, Mentor is a thriving manufacturing and retail center. But it might surprise you to learn that Mentor is also home to over 1,200 acres of preserved green space, the jewel of which is the Mentor Lagoons Nature Preserve. Consisting of over 230 acres, the preserve features 1.5 miles of Lake Erie Shoreline, trails, and a complex and interesting ecosystem which draws visitors from across the area. The preserve is located on the northwest boundary of the 800-acre Mentor Marsh State Nature Preserve, which is regarded as one of the best birding sites in the state, and it's getting better due to the amazing restoration work conducted by the Cleveland Museum of Natural History and other partners. We met up with City Naturalist Joel Throckmorton to talk about the significance of this diverse landscape for migrating birds. How long have you been into birding? How'd you get into this?
Well, I worked for AmeriCorps back in 2012, and working down in Florida, you just realize how many incredible species there are. Swallow-tailed kites, just these big birds of prey that migrate from Brazil up here in huge numbers, and just there's an incredible diversity of species. You realize tanagers, warblers, just so many species that utilize the Florida habitat. So I got back to it in 2012 and been traveling all around the country ever since then.
So that was the thing that originally inspired you? I mean, is this what you pursued in college, or?
My passion sort of started more with mammals, but over time got more and more comfortable with birds, and I worked at a banding station down in Texas and just fell in love with it down there, just seeing these warblers in your hand, walking up to a net, seeing 30 different warblers hanging out in the net, getting to band them, put metal bands on their legs. It's really cool.
So this isn't just a little side thing for you. I mean, you're really into birds.
Oh yeah, this is a passion for sure. You come out, as a birder, you come out here every day during migration, you use a scope, use binoculars to get into it and try to understand as much about these species that are utilizing the marsh as possible. And the more you can be out here and learn, the more knowledgeable you'll be about these species. I think we've documented 260 species within the Mentor Marsh, and that's a pretty impressive number for one ecosystem, one little area. So you've got egrets, herons, night herons, belted kingfishers all utilizing this habitat, and the accessibility of Mentor Lagoons is, I think, one of its attractants to a lot of different people. This viewpoint right here, you just look out, you've got this incredible view of a restored marsh that was at one time a monoculture of an invasive grass, and now there's burreed, there's all these native plants, all these native birds that are utilizing it. You could stand here for hours and see something new, whether it be a bug, bird, mammal, coyote. There's just a very impressive view from here, and along all the marsh trails there's some really great view and lookout points.
So out of the 260 species that you guys have observed here, what's the ratio in terms of birds that are native to here to those that are just migrating through?
Oh, that's a good question. A lot of the birds are either using this as wintering habitat to fuel up before they head back north to breed in Canada, or they're just utilizing it to refuel before they cross Lake Erie. So a lot of these species overwinter down in Brazil, in Argentina, and they migrate potentially 5,000 miles up to northern Canada. So we've got a pretty cool they call it stopover spot, where a lot of birds will just migrate in huge numbers, stop over to refuel and put on fat reserves so that they can continue their flight over Lake Erie. So it's a pretty cool phenomenon, and that's why a lot of birders get out in the spring and fall to see these birds that only really come through for a month out of the year, maybe 2 months.
So we had a bird here that got lost, right? A couple months ago. It shouldn't have been here, but it ended up here. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
I believe it was November. We had a tropical kingbird that is a very common flycatcher species down in Central America, but Ohio had its first record this fall, and someone just found it foraging, and it was trying to get insects, and there's not a whole lot of insects in the winter, so sometimes these birds just get blown way off course and they kind of just head in the wrong direction, and they call that a rarity, and birders will come from all over the state to chase that bird and see that bird. So we drew people in from, I'm sure, as far as Michigan and Kentucky to see that rare tropical kingbird right here at Mentor Lagoons. That was pretty cool.
So if somebody shows up on an average weekend, Saturday, Sunday, they really don't know a whole lot about birding. How do they get into it? What can they expect to see over here?
Well, I think the best way to get into it is first get yourself a decent pair of binoculars that you can actually make out details, not just one of those cheapo pairs, and get some sort of field guide that you can really, after you see a bird, you can really commit it to memory by looking at it in a field guide. So if you see one of these large herons sitting out here, large white egrets, you can go back and look at it in the book and kind of figure out what it is. There's also an Audubon app that you can download right to your smartphone and look at it that way. So that's a great resource and learning tool. We also just developed this birder checklist that has 260 species, over 260 species on it, that has birds that have all been observed within the greater Mentor Marsh area, and it has a breakdown for you by season, whether it's common in spring or rare in the summer. It'll give you an idea of when you can find that individual species there. So some of the more common birds that we have year-round here, belted kingfisher. There's, unfortunately geese year-round here. Some of the interesting migrants that we get great egret, barn swallows, and chimney swifts that fly over in large groups, and some of them will try to nest in the structures here, the chimney swifts especially. And like I said, in the spring and fall, we have about 30 species of warblers that migrate through that they refer to as the gems of the forest. And those are some pretty incredible species to see firsthand and see their breeding plumage, just to kind of be honored by their presence here is kind of special. If you're a birder, you get to see these birds just for a couple months a year, and they're only just transients from Brazil up to Canada, so we have a special opportunity to see them just for a short window. But if you come out here to see them, you got to be focused on what you're looking for, and it's a great way to learn as well, though.
So you guys have built a couple of Airbnbs here for these birds that come through here. The chimney swift house over there,
So the chimney swift is one of the species that's in huge decline. I think 60% of the population has been lost. And it was an Eagle Scout project that was done this summer it basically simulates a chimney, and the birds can fly in, but hopefully next year we're hoping they'll nest in them, and it just provides an additional structure for them to nest in. A lot of the migratory swifts will also hopefully utilize that during migration and fly in just to sleep in overnight. So that's kind of the hope for our chimney swift tower, is that we'll help protect a species that's been in serious decline and provide some sort of nesting structure for it. Purple martins that are a really hands-on bird and have a really long relationship with humans that dates back to the Native Americans, actually. The Native Americans put out gourds, like squash gourds, that these birds would nest in, and they became more and more reliant on that as they sort of had to compete with the invasive European starling. And so that bird really relies on human structures, or plastic gourds now, that we put out for them. And they breed in those every year. They migrate from as far as southern Brazil and Argentina, and they migrate around 5,000 miles each direction just to be with us here at the marsh and utilize all the resources, all the insects that we have. I mean, the dragonfly population here is very, very impressive. So they can eat all sorts of insects, feed their young, and each pair will nest in a gourd, and they don't necessarily have the same mate from season to season. So the males usually arrive sometime around mid to early April, and the females will arrive a little bit later, probably beginning of May. So still when the weather is rather cold here, so they have quite a battle to fight over that first month, and then they'll start building their nest. Each pair is committed to each other, and they'll lay about 6 eggs, and each bird they'll fledge hopefully after about 30 days. And we've actually started banding them, putting metal bands on each bird's legs, so every year we can get data on these returning martins, get an idea how old they are, their sex, things like that, other biological data that we can take.
That's very cool. So growth in terms of species here in the marsh, as the work that the Cleveland Museum of Natural History has done as it starts to take hold and these different types of plants, emerge, are we going to expect additional species to come through, or are we just kind of limiting out at this point?
So yeah, in a long-term sense, the more variety of plants and the bigger diversity there is, the more diversity of birds there will be. So long-term, we can expect, fingers crossed, black-necked stilts, which have been expanding their range northward and are seen in sort of the McGee Marsh, western part of the state. Every year now, someone usually sees an American avocet on one of the beaches on headlands, sanderlings, and for the past couple years we've had least bitterns that are confirmed to be breeding within the marsh, which is a really exciting species. I believe they're threatened in the state of Ohio, or at least declining, so to have them here at the marsh is pretty special. We have a really substantial population of breeding Virginia rails and soras as well. And if you've heard the phrase thin as a rail,
yeah, that's really where it came from.
So that comes from the marsh bird, the rail, because they have really slender bodies. They work their way through the vegetation. They have these feet that are huge, so they can run over lilies. They can run all over, sort of like walk-on-water birds. And we have a nice population of those, especially along the Wake Robin Boardwalk. You can hear them and see their chicks. They're these just little fluffy fuzzballs when they fledge in, sometime in midsummer. And you can see those up close in person right along the Wake Robin Boardwalk if you have the patience for it. They are secretive marsh birds for a reason, but they will come out into the open. Hopefully, as the marsh continues to improve throughout the fall and throughout the years, we'll have migrating sandhill cranes landing in drier parts of the marsh. Last year we had tundra swans that were overwintering, or at least migrating here and utilizing for a couple weeks at a time. And there was a vagrant American white pelican this spring here that just happened to show up, and they breed. They winter down in Florida and they breed up in Canada, so to have them one stop here is pretty rare. They might become more and more common. The pelican is becoming quite common in the western part of the state, so we're hoping it'll become quite common here in the marsh eventually as it continues to improve and as the Phragmites becomes less and less. We have these really open waterways now that a lot of fish can spawn in and birds can feed in, and that's really productive for a lot of different species.
Well, the changes that we've seen here just in the last 10 years have been pretty dramatic. The changes that you've probably seen in the last 2 seasons, maybe not so much. But where do you think this stands in terms of overall sites throughout the state of Ohio?
I think it's becoming one of the best spots in Ohio. You've got McGee Marsh, obviously, to compete with, but as far as Northeast Ohio goes, our location right on Lake Erie kind of is the perfect location for there to be a lot of number of species, like I said earlier, to refuel and put on fat. And the insect population is doing really well, so the birds can forage here. They can breed here with all this burr reed that you see is great structure for a lot of breeding marsh birds to really utilize. So I think our overall abundance and diversity will continue to go up as the different organizations continue to restore this marsh, and we're hoping that more and more people will realize the resource we have here and come visit us out in Mentor.